Don't hurt him! I'll buy him. The obese girl said. It was a dry sound, like old leather pulled too tight. Sunlight burned down on the wooden platform in Redemption Springs, bleaching the faces of the crowd and turning sweat into salt on every lip. Boots shuffled. Someone laughed too loudly. Someone else spat. Kael Whitefang knelt at the center of it all, wrists chained behind his back, blood drying along his jaw. Even on his knees, he looked dangerous to them. Broad shoulders, bare chest, bruised purple and black, muscles drawn tight, not in fear, but restraint. A man built for the mountains, dragged into a town that had already decided what he was worth. "Savage!" someone yelled. The mayor raised his gavel, enjoying the silence that followed. This wasn't justice. This was theater. I've seen crowds like this before. Folks who wouldn't pull the lever themselves, but sleep just fine knowing someone else did. The West was full of that kind of courage. The rope was lifted. That's when she spoke. "Don't hurt him." The voice cracked, thin, human. Wrong for a place like this. Heads turned, laughter followed. "I'll buy him." Now that did it. The square froze. Even the rope stopped swaying. Standing at the edge of the crowd was Miriam Hale, cheeks flushed, hands shaking, body heavy with the years of being told to stay quiet and out of the way. A woman no one listened to, a woman the town had already dismissed as excess weight in human form. She stepped forward anyway. "Call him savage, all you want," she said, louder now, each word costing her something. "I see a man worth saving." I watched Kael lift his head then, just once, confused, wary. Like a wounded animal that didn't understand why someone would step between it and the blade. The mayor smiled. That kind of smile only shows up when a man thinks he's about to profit twice. Behind them, the rope creaked again, because what most people didn't know yet, what they were about to learn the hard way, was that this wasn't just a hanging interrupted by pity. It was the beginning of a debt paid in blood, loyalty, and choices you don't walk away from clean. Before we rewind and see how a woman no one respected came to own the fate of the most feared man in town, tell me something. Where are you right now, and what are you doing as you hear this story? Let's step back a few days, before the rope, before the shouting, before Miriam Hale found her voice. Redemption Springs was one of those frontier towns that liked its name more than it liked justice, built around a mineral spring and a rail spur that never quite arrived. It survived on cattle deals, land speculation, and the quiet understanding that power mattered more than truth. The main street was wide and dusty, lined with false front buildings trying to look important. A saloon on one end, the gallows on the other. That should tell you enough. People here didn't ask who you were. They asked who owned you. Miriam Hale grew up learning how to take up less space in a body that refused to shrink. She moved slowly, carefully, like someone always apologizing with her posture. Her dresses were practical, brown and mended, chosen to hide rather than express. When she walked, heads turned, not with interest, but judgment. The town saw her as wasted potential, too big, too quiet, too much food for no return. Her father, Marcus Hale, owned the largest general store in Redemption Springs. He sold flour, lamp oil, nails, bullets, everything a town like this needed to survive. But survival didn't soften him. If anything, it sharpened his cruelty. Miriam was reminded daily that her mother died bringing her into the world. It wasn't shouted often. It didn't need to be. Silence can accuse louder than words. I've known men like Marcus. They confuse provision with love and think that entitles them to break what disappoints them. Miriam worked the store, hauled sacks of grain, counted ledgers late into the night. She did everything asked of her and more, because that's what invisible people do. They try to earn their right to exist. Kael Whitefang lived on the opposite edge of town, both literally and socially. He slept where the pines thickened and the land rose toward the mountains. Half Cherokee, half Irish, he belonged nowhere. The town respected. He trapped, hunted, sold pelts, and kept to himself. He spoke little. When he did, it was careful, measured. Men like Kael scared towns like Redemption Springs, not because they're violent, but because they don't need permission. The Harlan brothers owned most of the surrounding ranch land. They were respectable on paper. Church donors, businessmen. Everyone knew they used hired guns to pressure smaller claim holders. But nobody said it out loud. The mayor owed them. So did the council. So did the sheriff, when it suited him. Kael refused to sell his creekside claim. That was his crime. Around town, people whispered about him. Savage, killer, animal. Words are cheap when they're doing someone else's killing for you. Miriam noticed Kael because he didn't look at her the way others did. When he came into the store, he paid fair prices. When her father insulted her, Kael didn't intervene. He didn't pity her either. He just quietly picked up what she dropped and moved on. It was the closest thing to respect she'd known. In the saloon, men drank and laughed about the hanging like it was already done. Outside, the gallows waited, newly reinforced. The town liked to prepare early for death. What they didn't see coming was that the woman they'd spent years ignoring was about to make herself impossible to dismiss. Sometimes the most dangerous person in a room is the one who's had nothing left to lose for a long time. Kael Whitefang didn't fear death. That's the part most people get wrong. He feared being caged by a lie. On the night before the hanging, he sat alone in the holding shed behind the mayor's office, wrists raw from iron, back screaming where boots and rifle stocks had taught their lessons. The place smelled like old blood and cheap whiskey. Someone had spilled liquor nearby, and the sour bite of it clung to the air. Every breath pulled memories up with it. He'd smelled that same whiskey years ago on a different night, a different fire. Kael had been younger then, leaner, less quiet. His mother's people had taught him how to read land, how to move without disturbing it. His father taught him how to fight, how to stand his ground when men decided you were less than them. That education came at a cost. The first man Kael ever killed wasn't supposed to die. It was a hired gun, drunk and laughing, firing into a winter camp to scare people off a creek claim. Kael remembered the sound his rifle made. Too loud, too final. He remembered the way the man's laughter stopped halfway through a breath. After that, running became easier than staying. Every place Kael settled, someone wanted what little he had: land, pelts, control. The West had a way of circling men like him, waiting for an excuse. By the time the Harlan brothers sent their men, Kael already knew how it would end. He just hadn't expected it to end with a rope. In the shed he tested the chain again, knowing it wouldn't give. His hand shook, not from fear, but from anger he'd swallowed too many times. He kept his head down when guards passed. He didn't beg. Begging taught men the wrong lesson. What Kael wanted wasn't revenge. It was quiet. A piece of land no one argued over. A creek that stayed clean. Nights where the only sound was wind in the trees instead of boots on gravel. That kind of peace costs more than bullets in places like Redemption Springs. Across town, Miriam sat on the edge of her bed, dress still on, hands folded in her lap. She hadn't slept either. Her room was small and neat, chosen that way on purpose. Less space meant fewer chances to be noticed. The floorboards creaked when she shifted her weight. She stayed still. I know that stillness. It's the kind you learn when every movement has been criticized since childhood. Miriam's fear wasn't loud. It lived in her shoulders, hunched forward as if bracing for a blow. It lived in the way she rehearsed conversations that never happened, in the way she apologized before anyone accused her. She told herself she was safe because she was invisible. But that night, she realized something ugly. Being invisible meant you watched injustice happen without anyone expecting you to care. She thought about Kael's eyes when her father shouted at her in the store. Not soft, not cruel, just tired. Like a man who knew exactly how the world worked and paid the price anyway. Miriam didn't want to be brave. She didn't picture herself stopping a hanging. What she wanted was simpler and harder. She wanted, for once, to choose something herself. If Kael died, she would live, knowing she'd stood in a crowd and done nothing. That knowledge felt heavier than her body ever had. When dawn came, Kael stood without resistance. When the guards dragged it out of him, he didn't look for mercy, and Miriam, standing among the townsfolk an hour later, realized her goal wasn't to save a savage. It was to prove to herself more than anyone that she wasn't as small as the town had decided she was. I've lived long enough to tell you this. Courage doesn't show up shouting. Sometimes it shows up tired, shaking, and late. But it shows up anyway. In the Wild West, friendship usually starts with suspicion. This one started with a contract and a crowd waiting to see who'd break first. The mayor didn't argue with Miriam's offer. Men like Silas Garrett never argue when money walks toward them. He just leaned back, fingers steepled, eyes moving between the girl everyone mocked and the man everyone feared. "There's a price for mercy," he said, loud enough for the square to hear. And a cost. That's when the terms were laid out. 5 years, indentured service. Kael Whitefang would live under Miriam Hale's name, her responsibility, her liability. If he ran, she paid. If he fought, she paid. If he killed, she paid, in ways money couldn't cover. I've seen deals like that before. They're designed to look generous while tightening the rope. Miriam's hand shook when she signed, not because she didn't understand what she was doing, but because she understood it perfectly. $200 gone in a single stroke. Her inheritance, her escape fund, every quiet future she'd imagined. Kael watched her from the platform, eyes narrowed. When the chains were unlocked, he didn't move right away. "You don't owe me this," he said low, meant only for her. Miriam didn't look up at him. "I know." That answer unsettled him more than gratitude ever could. They walked back through town together under the weight of stares. The crowd parted like water around stone. Some faces showed curiosity, others disgust. A few, fear, redemption. Springs had just been forced to reconsider two people it thought it understood. At the Hale house, Marcus erupted exactly the way Miriam expected. Anger, insults, threats. Kael stood still through it all, shoulders squared, eyes forward. He'd faced worse men than this. But Miriam surprised him. She stood between them, not shouting, not pleading, standing. That's when Kael understood the shape of their alliance. She wasn't buying protection. She was claiming ground. Later, in the cramped loft above the store, Kael finally spoke again. "If I try to leave," he said, "they'll come for you." Miriam nodded. "I know." "If I stay," he continued, "they'll test me." "I know that too." He studied her then, really looked, not her size, not her fear, her resolve. It was uneven, untrained, but real. Kael had survived his whole life by keeping distance, by never needing anyone. This arrangement broke every rule he lived by. And Miriam, she had spent her life believing strength came from enduring quietly. Now she was tied, legally and publicly, to a man the town wanted dead. Neither of them trusted the situation. But trust wasn't what bound them. It was choice. I've learned something over the years. The most dangerous partnerships aren't built on affection, they're built on mutual risk. And both of them had just stepped into something that would demand blood, loyalty, and decisions neither could take back. The first mistake Redemption Springs made was assuming the deal ended at the gallows. It didn't. It only changed shape. For the first few days, Kael kept his head down. He hauled crates, split wood, repaired a broken wagon axle behind the store. He worked like a man who knew eyes were always on him. Shoulders loose but ready, movements efficient, no wasted strength. The chains were gone, but the contract hung heavier than iron. People came by just to stare. Some did it openly, some pretended to shop. A few spat near his boots. Kael ignored all of it. He'd learned long ago that attention was just another weapon. Miriam watched from behind the counter, hands busy, heart loud. Every sound made her flinch. Every raised voice sent her pulse racing. She'd never been the center of a town's gossip before, not like this. Being mocked was one thing. Being responsible was another. I've seen folks confuse courage with comfort. They're not the same. Courage usually hurts more. The first real test came a week later. A cattle drive passed through town, hired hands drunk and loud. One of them recognized Kael. "That's the savage," the man slurred. "Thought we hanged your kind." Kael didn't respond. He kept stacking feed sacks. Miriam saw it happen and felt that old instinct rise up. "Stay quiet. Don't escalate. Don't be noticed." The man shoved Kael anyway. Kael's hands clenched. His jaw tightened. He looked at Miriam, just once. She nodded. That nod mattered. Kael moved fast. He didn't throw a punch. He stepped inside the man's balance and dropped him clean with a shoulder check that knocked the air out of him. No blood, no broken bones. Just a lesson. The crowd erupted. Someone ran for the sheriff. Miriam stood between Kael and the shouting men, her voice trembling but firm. He was attacked. You all saw it. The sheriff arrived, irritated. He looked at the man on the ground, then at Kael, then at Miriam. "Next time," he said, "there won't be a next time." They all understood what that meant. That night, Miriam cried in the pantry where no one could see her. Kael sat outside on the steps, staring into the dark. He hated that nod, hated that she'd trusted him, hated that it felt good. The second test was quieter. Suppliers stopped extending credit. Customers hesitated. The Harlan brothers didn't threaten openly. They didn't need to. Pressure works better when it looks like coincidence. Miriam's father blamed her, loudly, daily. "You brought this on us," Marcus snapped one evening. "That man will ruin everything." Kael stood up from the table. "Say it to me." Marcus backed down, but the damage was done. Miriam didn't sleep that night. She lay awake thinking about ledgers, debt, and how close she was to losing the only thing that gave her shelter. Kael found her at dawn, sitting on the back steps. "I can leave," he said. Miriam shook her head. "They'd come for you." And me. That's already happening. She looked up at him then, really looked. I didn't save you to give you back. He had no answer for that. The third test came with fire. One night, while the town slept, someone shattered the front window of the store and tossed in a bottle soaked in oil. It didn't explode the way they'd hoped. The fire caught low and slow, licking shelves instead of walls. Kael smelled it first. He didn't shout. He moved. He kicked the door in, threw his coat over the flames, dragged barrels of water from the back. Miriam followed him barefoot, hauling buckets despite the heat, despite the weight, despite the panic clawing at her chest. By the time the fire died, the store was damaged but standing. The message was clear. You are not welcome. The next morning the mayor came by, shaking his head in practiced sympathy. Unfortunate, he said. This town can be dangerous. Miriam met his gaze. So can I. He laughed, unsure whether to take her seriously. That afternoon, Kael found the tracks behind the store. 3 sets, Harlan men. He said nothing. 2 days later, a rancher named Caleb was found beaten outside town. He'd seen too much during Kael's original arrest. He was supposed to testify when a circuit judge came through next month. Now he was silent. Kael paced that night like a caged animal. This ends, he said, or it kills us. Miriam felt the truth of that settle into her bones. She was tired, tired of fear, tired of being careful. What do we do? She asked. Kael hesitated, then spoke words he'd avoided his entire life. We fight smart. They didn't confront the Harlans directly. Not yet. Kael escorted supply wagons for neighboring farms, building quiet goodwill. Miriam extended credit again, selectively, tying people closer than they realized. Word spread, slowly. The store became necessary again, but necessity breeds resentment. The Harlan brothers escalated. A bounty notice appeared, not for Kael, for Miriam. Inciting unrest, a polite way to invite trouble. Kael tore it down with shaking hands. He felt the old instinct rise, run, disappear, end this before she paid more. That night, he packed his few belongings. Miriam found him. You leave, she said softly, and they'll hang someone else tomorrow. He stopped. I won't let them use you. You don't get to decide what I can endure. They stared at each other in the dim loft, 2 people shaped by different kinds of cruelty. Kael finally sat down. His hand shook. I don't know how to protect people. I only know how to survive. Miriam sat beside him, close. Then learn. That was the moment everything changed, not because they won, because they chose to stay. And in the West, staying is the most dangerous thing you can do. This is the part of the story where the ground gives way. Up until now, Kael believed the enemy wore the Harlan name. Big men, loud men, easy to hate, easy to aim at. He was wrong. The truth came on a gray morning, quiet enough to feel harmless. A circuit judge finally arrived in Redemption Springs. Judge Amos Bell, clean coat, calm voice, the kind of man towns trusted because he looked like order itself. He asked for statements, promised fairness, promised law. I've lived long enough to know this. The calmest voice in the room often belongs to the one holding the knife behind his back. Caleb, bruised but alive, was brought in to testify. He barely spoke above a whisper. His eyes never left the floor. Kael stood at the back of the hall. Miriam sat near the front, hands folded tight in her lap, breath shallow. Judge Bell listened, nodded, then asked one question too many. Mr. Whitefang, he said gently, why were you living on land without a registered claim? The room shifted. Kael felt it before he understood it. Bell wasn't here to hear the truth. He was here to rewrite it. The documents came out next. Old maps, new signatures. Suddenly, Kael's land belonged to the railroad, always had according to the paper. And the Harlans? Just middlemen. Messy, but useful. Miriam stood up. Those papers are false. Bell smiled. Miss Hale, please sit. That smile told Kael everything. Bell had signed the original warrant. Bell had delayed the circuit visit. Bell had approved the indenture instead of an investigation. The rope had always been waiting. They'd just needed time. After the hearing, Bell asked to speak privately. Kael refused, so Bell spoke anyway. You're strong, Bell said, almost kindly. But strength doesn't win wars. Compliance does. He glanced at Miriam. You, however, complicate things. That night, Kael broke. Not loudly, not violently. He sat alone behind the store with a bottle he hadn't touched in years. His hand shook so badly he spilled more than he drank. I've seen that look before. It's the moment a man realizes every road he ran down led to the same cliff. I should have let them hang me, he said when Miriam found him. She didn't argue. She just sat. They'll crush you, he continued. They'll bleed you dry until you're nothing. She nodded. Probably. He looked at her then, eyes red, voice raw. Why aren't you scared? She was. Terrified. But she was tired of fear owning her. Because if I run now, she said, I'll spend the rest of my life smaller than I already feel. Kael stared at the dirt. They won't stop. Then neither will we. The final blow came the next morning. Judge Bell signed an order transferring Miriam's store to the railroad for public necessity. Compensation pending. Pending meant never. Her father collapsed when he heard. Marcus Hale, proud and bitter and broken, finally saw the cost of silence. Kael watched Miriam read the notice. No tears, no shaking, just a slow, steady breath. This is my fault, he said. She folded the paper. No, this is theirs. He stood up, taller somehow, not angry, focused. I won't run any more. That decision scared Miriam more than anything else, because when a man stops running, something is about to burn, and Judge Bell had no idea how close the fire was. High noon doesn't announce itself with a bell. It creeps in on you. The sun climbed straight overhead, bleaching the dust out of Redemption Springs until everything looked flat and exposed. Doors stayed shut. Curtains twitched. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Kael stood in the middle of the main street. No coat, no rifle. Just a revolver on his hip he hadn't drawn in years. His shoulders were relaxed, but his spine was straight. A man who had already decided how far he was willing to go. Across from him, Judge Amos Bell stepped out onto the boardwalk, boots polished, hat clean. Two deputies flanked him. Behind them, the Harlan brothers hovered like carrion birds, hands never far from their guns. Miriam watched from the store doorway. Her heart hammered so hard she could taste iron. She wanted to shout, to stop this, to pull Kael back inside and bar the door like a frightened child. She didn't. I've learned something ugly about courage. It doesn't feel noble in the moment. It feels like standing still while everything in you screams to move. Bell raised his voice, calm and practiced. Kael Whitefang, you are ordered to leave this town and all surrounding lands by sundown. Failure to comply will be met with force. Kael didn't reach for his gun. He reached into his coat and held up a folded bundle of papers. These are affidavits, he said. His voice carried farther than he expected. Signed by 6 men who watched the Harlans murder my witness. Signed by 2 railroad surveyors you paid off. And signed by a man you thought was already dead. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Bell's smile tightened. You expect us to believe a savage over a judge? Kael looked past him. Ask Caleb. Caleb stepped out from behind the blacksmith's shop, pale, limping, alive. Bell's deputies shifted. The Harlans swore under their breath. Bell's hand twitched. That was the moment. The gunfire didn't start loud. It started fast. One of the Harlan brothers drew too early. Kael moved on instinct, years of violence snapping back into place. One shot. Clean. The man fell screaming, leg shattered. Chaos exploded. Deputies fired into the crowd. Kael rolled, came up behind a trough, returned fire only when he had to. He wasn't hunting. He was ending the fight. Miriam dragged a woman to cover as glass shattered behind her. Fear clawed her throat, but she stayed upright. She stayed present. Bell tried to run. Kael caught him halfway down the street. The judge slipped in the dust, scrambling, dignity gone. Kael stood over him, revolver steady, hand shaking just enough to be human. Bell looked up. You pulled that trigger. You prove everything they say about you. Kael's finger tightened. I've seen men lose themselves in moments like this, seen them become exactly what the world expects. Kael lowered the gun. No, he said quietly. I end it. He stepped back, kicked Bell's weapon away, let the townsfolk see him alive, broken, exposed. The sheriff arrived late, breathless, staring at the mess he'd helped ignore. Bell was arrested. The Harlans fled. One bled out before sunset. When it was over, the street looked the same. But it wasn't. Kael walked back toward the store, toward Miriam. She didn't run to him. She waited. When he reached her, he stopped, unsure for the first time all day. You stayed, he said. She nodded. So did you. And that, more than any bullet, changed everything. When the smoke thinned, Redemption Springs didn't cheer. It exhaled. The dead were carried away without speeches. Blood was scraped from the boards with river sand. By dusk, wagons rolled again, as if the town was embarrassed by what it had almost become. Judge Bell was gone by morning, chained and silent. The Harlan Ranch stood abandoned within a week. Men who once laughed the loudest now avoided eye contact. Kael didn't stay in the street long. He helped fix the shattered windows, repaired the store door with hands that had broken bones hours earlier. No one thanked him out loud, but no one called him savage again either. That's how change usually looks. Smaller than the stories promise, quieter, almost disappointing. Miriam lost something too. The girl who believed goodness meant staying small never came back. In her place stood a woman who had learned that mercy isn't weakness. It's restraint, with teeth behind it. On the third night, the town settled into uneasy sleep. Kael sat on the steps behind the store, watching the road fade into darkness. Miriam joined him, her weight creaking the wood. Neither apologized for it. They didn't touch. They just sat, shoulder to shoulder, listening to crickets and distant water. Sometimes survival isn't about winning. It's about choosing not to disappear afterward. I've lived long enough to know this. The West doesn't reward kindness. It tests it, hard, over and over. Miriam didn't save Kael because she was brave. She saved him because she was tired of watching wrong things happen while good people stayed quiet. And Kael didn't become a better man because he was bought. He did because someone finally looked at him and saw a human being. Out here, dignity isn't given. it's chosen, sometimes loudly, sometimes at great cost. So let me ask you, before the fire burns low, where are you right now and what are you doing as you hear the end of this story? Tell me in the comments.